Welcome, everybody, to the final edition of the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Winter Webinar Series. Today, we're going to hear from Stephanie Smith with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets about a new law that's been passed regulating neonicotinoid insect use, and with special reference to vegetable food crops as much as possible. Take it away, Stephanie, and thanks for joining.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm appreciative of actually the opportunity to present in front of this crowd. I will try to focus on vegetables and fruit crops, but also I understand that some people might, they might work with others or, and share the message. So I want to just encourage folks that this is going to be, it's going to cross all dimensions of the restrictions of neonicotinoid use in the state of Vermont. So first off, Stephanie Smith, Vermont Agency of Agriculture. I work within the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division within the agency. And we are the group within the agency that regulates pesticide use, as well as fertilizer and feeds and seeds that are sold in the state, as well as we do the certification and training for all pesticide applicators, including private applicators in the state, in conjunction or actually more so under a certification and training EPA approved plan. So that's kind of broadly what we do within our division. And there's many of us, and some of you may be familiar with some of the field inspectors or the plant health team, because we also regulate nurseries that I personally work with here at the agency. So I'm going to talk about Act 182. Act 182, it does three things. It regulates the sales and use of neonicotinoid treated seeds. It regulates the application of neonicotinoid pesticides, and it also regulates the registration, or actually prohibits the registration of some neonicotinoid pesticides. So we as an agency would no longer be able to register some of these products. The other piece, just so you know, talking about registration, I'll go into it a little bit more, but in order to use a pesticide in the state of Vermont, it has to be registered by the Agency of Agriculture, and that includes 25Bs. Neonicotinoids don't fall into that classification, but I just wanted to share that information with folks. And moving on, so there are about 240 registered pesticides that are impacted in one way or another by either this law or a previous law from 2018 that made all outdoor use of the 2018 law made all outdoor use of neonicotinoid pesticides a Class A state restricted use pesticide. What that means in the state of Vermont is that you have to be a certified applicator to be able to purchase that Class A state restricted use pesticide, and you can only buy it from a Class A dealer in the state. So important changes, and that's from 2018 in reference to neonicotinoid pesticides. But then last year, in 2024, the legislature passed Act 182. So what is a neonicotinoid? It's a class of synthetic systemic insecticides that target an insect's nervous system that causes their death. It's non-specific. All insects could be impacted by this particular pesticide, which is one of the reasons why the legislature passed this law. There were concerns about pollinators being impacted by neonics, and they believe this would be a step in the right direction in order to support pollinator health. Some of the pests that I understand in the fruit and vegetable industry where neonicotinoids are used would be mealybugs, aphids, and whiteflies. I'm sure there are many others. So how do neonicotinoids work? So they get absorbed into plant tissue. That's part of the systemic portion of the definition of a neonicotinoid. And then bugs with or insects with mouth piercing or sucking mouth parts will take in the pesticide that's found in that plant tissue. I believe also that there's a contact, not a contact pesticide, but if an insect comes into contact with the pesticide, like in terms of dust, it can also impact that insect. So what are the chemistries or the active ingredients that we're talking about? So specifically as outlined in Vermont law, we're looking at acetamidoprid, dinotefuran, thiamethoxam, clothianidin, imidacloprid, thiacloprid, and nithiazine. And I might be saying that incorrectly. I understand that's the oldest neonicotinoid chemistry from a while back. And actually in the state of Vermont, we don't have any pesticides that are registered with that active ingredient, neither with thiacloprid, in fact, as well. But those are generally the chemistries. Additionally, if more chemistries come on board, the secretary by rule can add those neonicotinoids, those chemistries that meet the definition of a neonicotinoid, can add those to this list of prohibitions. Vermont's law is loosely based on New York's law, and actually New York's laws becoming effective is kind of the trigger for Vermont's laws to become effective. We understand that in 2024, December of 2024, I think it's imidacloprid and clothianidin in the state of New York were outlawed, but not the rest of the chemistries. Those are rolling in at a later date. In Vermont, that was enough to trigger our restrictions on pesticide use for for all the chemistries. We're implementing beginning in July of this year, actually, for the pesticide use portion of the law. To be clear, Act 182 does not impact some pesticide uses outdoor, and those include turf or structural insect control. Those are not impacted by this law. Roach and fly baits, as well as flea and tick pet product uses. So again, it has three components. The first component of the law addresses the prohibition on the distribution and sale and use of treated seeds specifically soybean and cereal grain crop groups. These will be prohibited. This date of this rollout is in January 1st of 2029. And that's, again, contingent upon New York's law becoming effective as well. And as far as we understand, they're moving forward in the state of New York with adopting rules in order to implement the treated seed portion of their law. The legislature, in terms of when they passed this law, did create an out that would allow individuals that need access to treated seeds, neonicotinoid treated seeds, and the limitations on being able to have access to a treated seed is dependent upon that grower completing an integrated pest management training, either provided by the Agency of Agriculture or another approved party. That individual has to submit to the agency a pest risk assessment that outlines that it is necessary that they have access to that treated seed. If the agency issues the exemption to allow for the use of that treated seed, it would be specific to particular fields. It could be potentially a geographic area based on the pest risk assessment that was submitted to the agency. But it's intended to be specific and not just a broad allowance for the use of that seed. And then additionally, a grower who receives that exemption has to maintain records of pesticide use. When the agency issues an exemption, they can establish, we can establish additional restrictions on the individual that's using that treated seed. And then in order to protect, pollinators and or birds, or public health or the health of a specific ecosystem, and we can also put additional exemptions that we see fit on the issuance of that. It's likely to be treated somewhat like a permit that some folks might be familiar with for the use of pesticides here at the agency. And then we have some steps that we have to take as an agency in terms of sharing the exemptions that we issue with the legislature. And then I understand that they have to then take steps to post them on their website. So that's the first category of restrictions on the use of neonicotinoids. The next category is the actual use of a neonicotinoid pesticide outdoors, as well as on ornamental plants. So beginning of July of this year, coming very soon, as we all know, as our lives pass before our eyes, the outdoor application to any crop during bloom, that will be prohibited. The outdoor application to soybeans or any of the cereal grain crop groups that we talked about earlier under the treated seed prohibition. The outdoor application to crops in the leafy vegetable, brassica, bulb vegetable, herb spices, stalk stem, leaf, petiole vegetable crop groups that are harvested after bloom. And I understand that there are a number, Vern and I were talking a little earlier, and I understand that there are a number of pesticide products that a conventional grower might use in their production practices that will become prohibited beginning in July of this year. The last prohibition is, yes.
I do just want to interrupt there because that's a little vague as far as botanical specificity. So potatoes, for example, are tubers, not bulbs.
Yep.
Are they covered?
Potato. I don't have a clear answer, but I'm going to write it down. I got my pen. Does this apply to potatoes? Are potatoes are harvested after bloom?
Yes.
Okay. So
and
I will.
Then there are a lot of root vegetables.
Yep.
There's no root mentioned here.
Yep.
Just want clarity for which crops are in and which are not.
Yep. I will definitely do a little research. I feel like this is based on potentially like USDA kind of crop groups, but I will investigate that and provide an answer to our listeners today. The final, again, the final prohibition is to ornamental plants, and that's an indoor-outdoor prohibition. Not that, well, I don't know how often. Anyway, we'll move on from that. But the word outdoor is not used. Oh, and then I wanted to go back and talk more about vegetables. So I'm not the individual that administers or will do the enforcement associated with pesticide use, with the misuse of a pesticide in accordance with Vermont law or under Vermont law. So a determination of whether or not something is indoors or outdoors will be fact specific. And it may be based on, obviously based on whatever's happening in the field. But it potentially, Dave Huber is the enforcement, the manager of the enforcement team and interprets the law. Is a greenhouse potentially could be considered outdoors only because it has access to the outdoors and it has free air moving in and out and potential. And if the goal is and the intent is of the law is to protect pollinators and non-target insects, that could be limited to application within a greenhouse setting. I just wanted to mention that. But again, it'll be based on the facts that are presented at the time of an inspection, quite possibly. So ornamental plants, I just wanted to review that. There's a definition in the law that articulates what's considered an ornamental plant. Again, this does not apply to turf. And I know this crowd isn't really necessarily interested in that, but turf was removed from the original legislation. And so it was clear to us that it wasn't meant to cover turf. Additionally, there's a definition of ornamental within the Vermont rule for the control of pesticides to further clarify the definition above. Now we're on to the third restriction. So we have the treated seeds, we have the pesticide use, and the third restriction is actually on the agency. We are now prohibited or prevented from registering pesticides that are used for the outdoor application to any crop during bloom, which isn't the case. There aren't any neonicotinoids that would actually permit that. That's usually a label restriction. So that's not necessarily a problem, or the outdoor application to soybeans or cereal grain crop groups. So it's if the pesticide product is specifically labeled for soybean, for instance, we would be prohibited from registering that product in the state of Vermont. Therefore, somebody would not be able to have access to that product, or shouldn't be able to have access to that product or use that product in our state. So it's kind of a belt and suspenders kind of thing. It's not just the prohibition on the individual using the pesticide, but there's the prohibition on the agency from registering that pesticide. And that also applies for the other two bullet points here with the outdoor application for all the vegetables, herbs, spices, so on and so forth, as well as application to ornamental plants. Now, if the product was labeled for both application to an ornamental plant or a vegetable and turf, the agency could register that product so that turf growers would have access to that product because there is no prohibition for their use. So I just wanted
Stephanie, will
Yes.
there be a unique label for Vermont that clarifies that, or will it be up to the grower to know they can't use it even though it's on the label?
Correct. It'll be up to the grower to know. We won't ask for specific labels for our state. So yeah, the grower will have to know. Or it's not our expectation of industry to provide a separate label for us. So likewise, as we talked about treated seed, there are exemptions that exist, and an individual that believes that they have a valid agricultural or environmental emergency can make a request to the agency to enable them to use that pesticide. Like the easy case that I can think of is potentially spotted lanternfly coming to our state, where we currently do not have spotted lanternfly in our state. And we as a state know that responding rapidly to a new insect pest before it becomes established is a good thing. So that potentially could be in a case for when the agency may issue an exemption. But it just, again, it's dependent on the circumstances. So under what circumstances can the agency issue an exemption? And that is that the pesticide would be effective in addressing that particular emergency, and that there's no other less harmful pesticide or management practice that would be effective in addressing that emergency. The agency is currently developing a website and materials so that they're available before July 1st, so that individuals that want to make a request for an exemption will be able to do so or familiarize themselves with those materials in advance. We are required to consider a couple of points prior to issuing that exemption. But first off, what is an agricultural emergency? It is an occurrence of any pest that presents an imminent risk of significant harm, injury, or loss to agricultural crops. And then likewise, an environmental emergency is very much the same, and it actually incorporates the definition to some extent of the agricultural emergency, but this would be risk or harm to the environment. And that it would be required to use the neonicotinoid pesticide in order to prevent the risk from occurring or to mitigate that risk. So the agency who issue, as we issue an exemption order, there are specific things that we have to outline within that exemption order. And one of them is the duration of the use of that pesticide. And that it can't be valid for greater than 1 year. We also would have to specify which crops, which locations that the order applies. So like a site type crop or site. And then also specifically the geographic scope of the allowance for that particular exemption. And then the date on which that exemption begins. So this is, in addition to that work, and based on the information that's submitted to the agency, we have to provide a detailed evaluation as to why that emergency, agricultural or environmental emergency, exists. And then we must share this with the legislature. Again, all written exemption orders issued by the agency under this new Act 182 have to be shared with the legislature or certain committees within the legislature, and it gets posted on their website. In addition to the standards that I'd mentioned earlier, like site location, crop that it's being applied to, geographic location, and the duration for the exemption, the agency can place conditions on that exemption order. Again, it'll be treated much like a permit, and we can put additional kinds of standards to protect pollinators, and then also the public if necessary. So interestingly, this year, I'm just alerting folks to this, a bill was introduced. I believe it's 372. It has only been introduced. I don't believe they've taken much testimony on it as of yet, but it's contemplating expanding the restrictions on the use of neonicotinoids to both nursery starts and potted plants. And here are the definitions of those terms as currently proposed within the House Bill 372. We operated on a biennium in the state of Vermont, which means if it doesn't get across the finish line and put into law, and this likely isn't going to move forward this year, it can be taken up again next year. Just letting people know. And it is a pretty broad prohibition on the use of any neonicotinoid pesticides on herbaceous, cultural, or ornamental plants that are sold in a container less than a gallon size. And that doesn't qualify as a nursery start, only because it also applies to nursery starts as defined in the term above. This is just an existing law, just to provide context for what a nursery is and how we regulate nurseries in Vermont. And then I wanted to move on a little bit, and I'm going to share a little bit of information about what's happening in adjacent states. So again, as I mentioned earlier, Vermont's law is loosely based on New York's law. New York's law, I don't administer New York's law. Obviously, I'm not in New York. And if you had questions with respect to New York, I would suggest consulting with folks in New York. Their law is administered by their Department of Environmental Conservation, and with assistance from their Department of Agriculture. So the responsibility is somewhat split within that state, which is a little different. In Vermont, we're all, we regulate both pesticide use and agriculture within our one agency. So we're coordinated here. But it's the prohibition in New York on treatment of outdoor ornamental plants, as well as turf. However, there is an exception for agricultural commodities. So that's one of the big differences between Vermont's law and New York's law. But with the one caveat that application to an agricultural commodity can't be done during bloom. And then, as I mentioned earlier, their clothianidin, dinotefuran, sorry, not imidacloprid, that became effective in December of last year. And then the other chemistries that were on an earlier slide, imidacloprid, and the others, those will become effective in New York in 2026. Another exemption is that in New York, you could continue to apply pesticides to treat for invasive insect species. So things like emerald ash borer or spotted lanternfly, without, there's no limitation in the state of New York with respect to that, except for following the label, I should say. The label is the law, and you always have to follow the label on any pesticide product, but they allow for treatment for invasive species. New York also has an education requirement. Their education requirement applies across both treated seed and pesticide use, whereas in Vermont, it's just if you're going to use a treated seed for which you've received an exemption for. And then they have to take it annually, as you do in Vermont for treated seed, and then maintain record of having taken that course for holding on to that record for 3 years. Other limitations generally in adjacent states are outlined here. Maine also has a broad prohibition on the outdoor use of neonicotinoids. It includes lawn, turf, and ornamental vegetation. Then there's the treated seed in New York and Vermont. And then New Hampshire, they had considered something in 2019 along with other pesticide chemistries, but that did not get passed. In addition to the prohibitions that the state of Vermont that I've talked about already, the agency is required to go through the rulemaking process, which I believe we've begun, to adopt best management practices for the use of treated seeds when it is, prior to the prohibition becoming effective, as well as post the prohibition becoming effective. Those best management practices may include how to dispose of treated seed to ensure that they're disposed properly, and other elements in storage, so on and so forth, just to additionally protect public health and pollinators. The best management practices will also include how to use a neonicotinoid pesticide when that is permitted under an exemption. And then finally, there are the uses that are not prohibited, and these best management practices will apply to those uses that are allowed to continue. While best management practices are not considered binding on individuals, it is possible under an exemption that's issued by the agency that we would implement any of these best management practices as conditions, which I mentioned. The agency has the authority to set additional restrictions on the use of neonicotinoids, and we might again use some of these best practices as a part of that permitting process. So I already reviewed a bit of this. They're not enforceable, but the BMPs do support existing laws and rules. The label is the law. I'll say that again. And we may use them in association with the exemptions that are issued as conditions to those permits. So alternative pesticides. There are alternatives. I reference here Grower Talks magazine. This is a 2024 screenshot, or a screenshot from a Growers Talk magazine from 2024. Vern had mentioned that there's the New England Vegetable Growers Guide.
Vegetable Management Guide.
Vegetable Management Guide. That would also be instructive in terms of identifying potentially the pests that you're trying to control, as well as the active ingredients. Here I've highlighted imidacloprid and dimetepharin and the products that are associated with it, because growers may be more familiar with the products rather than the actual active ingredients. And then also alternatives for those uses. Vern, before I gave you my slide, I know I gave you a slide deck, but why don't I give you a refreshed one with a different screenshot for the publication that is a little more instructive for our group here. As we approach this July 1st deadline, one of the things that I wanted to share with folks is that you may already have some of these products in your possession. And you're probably wondering what you should do with those products. So of course, up until July 1st, you can use these products in accordance with the label in your production practices. But after July 1st, even if you are in possession of these products, you are no longer permitted to use them. The prohibition goes into effect. And so you can, if they're not opened, I would recommend trying to return them to the retailer where you purchased the product. If you are unable to do that, or if they are open, you can always dispose of the pesticide at your local solid waste management district. However, there may be costs associated with that disposal. So I have some resources here, and I'll update this. Oh, I wanted to mention, in addition to the New England Growers Vegetable Management Guide, We also have at our agency a database called Kelly Solutions, and you can search Kelly Solutions by pest or by active ingredient to determine whether or not you need an alternative product or whether or not the product you have in your possession is considered a neonicotinoid. So we have that database as well. You can always contact us and we can help you. We're here to answer questions and help growers comply with the law. And then also some of my photographs I got from some resources here, some folks. So I just wanted to give credit. And then that's it. Half hour, I went quick, but I welcome questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. And you might stop your screen sharing just so folks can show their faces. We did have a question in the chat from Cheryl about disposal of large amounts of pesticides. And, while you were talking, I went and looked just at my solid waste district down here. And there's a hazardous waste disposal page. You make an appointment. It says household hazardous waste.
Yeah, so hazardous waste facilities do accept quantities that meet the definition of a very, very small quantity generator, VSQG. And it's their standard, I think it's less than 200 pounds of a hazardous chemical. So they do accept it. But you should make an appointment. You should always contact your solid waste management entity in advance to ensure that they're prepared to accept whatever you have, and can potentially give you an estimate of the cost of disposal. Very large quantities. So the goal in pesticide use, obviously, is that folks buy what they need, know what they have, store appropriately. Like those are kind of like the initial steps you take. If you have very large quantities, you can contact, like beyond being able to transport in a vehicle, you could contact a hazardous waste disposal service in order to assist you with, I'm going to use the term clean out, but a clean out of a facility or a barn that contains large quantities of chemicals. I'm not going to say that it's cheap. It can be very expensive. But those are kind of the opportunities that I know exist, and the individuals or vendors, contractors that can assist with that process. Cheryl, do you have any other questions with respect to that?
No, thank you, Stephanie, for answering that. I guess it just comes down to the concern about the cost of getting rid of these products when they're just kind of forced to get rid of them in the first place. And I'm like, well, I don't know, maybe the state has come up with something that, can help with this other than, contacting the solid waste district. So
yes, the state doesn't currently operate. We don't operate a program of collection and disposal that's specifically run by the state. The state does currently defray the costs associated with the disposal of pesticides. But that's a grant that's provided to the solid waste management entities. And then it's a reimbursement grant process, which is why I say you should call them, because they likely, so long as it's not like lots and lots and lots of pesticides, they can probably take the pesticides that you have in your possession. And agreed, that laws change how we manage the disposal of pesticides or the use of those pesticides. So we understand that exists. This year, under a House Bill 484, that is on the Senate side, there is some language there to increase the fee to register pesticides in order to further subsidize the disposal of those pesticides. And this money will support the solid waste management entities more than the state is able to support the solid waste management entities. And so there will be, I don't know, but there's a bill that's moving to increase the money that goes to solid waste management entities to address this specific disposal issue. So that's hopeful, I guess.
Yeah,
And just
that's
as,
great.
as
If-
an
if- if-
FYI, in my district, it's $15 per 5-gallon load per resident. So it doesn't seem exorbitant, assuming they have to take these materials.
And it's convenient. I mean, the solid waste management entities and hazardous waste and pesticide disposals, pesticides kind of fit under that umbrella, but they're accepting lots of different types of corrosive, explosive, pressurized types of products that would meet that more broad definition of a hazardous household waste. They're there to take those. They're currently rolling out a extended producer responsibility program, which the producers of those hazardous wastes, excluding pesticides, will pay for the disposal completely of those hazardous household wastes. That's not really on topic, I apologize, but
no, it's good information.
I'm trying to promote responsible disposal. And the reason it's convenient and the way, and responsible is to make sure that we don't have releases into the environment.
Yeah. And if pesticide companies, created these in smaller quantities, so they wouldn't have to buy so much in the first place, it'd be a little bit better.
Yeah.
And Stephanie, are the companies or the distributor or dealer obligated to take back unopened containers?
I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's worth asking specifically. I don't, I've not contacted the retailers, but I think it's a first step. This law is becoming effective, and we would, farmers would like to be able to return unopened products. Yeah.
Are there other questions from folks on the webinar? The question is about whether each country makes its own rules for neonic products.
I know we've done a little bit of research with Canada with respect to treated seed, and I know that certain provinces in Canada have a limitation on the use of neonicotinoid treated seeds. So yes, different countries, they have different approval processes and they have different rules and regulations with respect to chemistries. It's different everywhere. So in Vermont, we're trying to be consistent.
Even with beneficial insects, right, Cheryl? So Stephanie, I did look in the vegetable management guide to confirm that carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes all have neonicotinoid insecticides labeled and listed for sometimes several pests for those crops.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be great to get clarification whether root vegetables are part of this regulation.
Yeah, we do know that saffron, that was the one product that we knew we could positively identify. And I want to say that it's possible that some flowers that are harvested as an herb or a spice, like dill, I would imagine dill would be covered as well, because they're potentially harvested after bloom or seed producing kinds of spices. So yeah, there would be a prohibition on those as well. But I will provide clarity, and I will update my slides for you, Vern, to include the vegetable management guide and a screenshot, and then that resource as well as in the presentation, so that these folks have that information.
Yeah, I'd be happy to work with you to create a separate list, and maybe you could post it, because all of those crops each have an insect section, which lists all of the key insects and then lists all of the pesticides. It's going to be pretty cumbersome to have clarity of specifically which products appear to be approved, but in Vermont are not allowed.
Yeah, that would be great. We would love to work with you, Vern. I've got a to-do, couple to-dos, at least three to-dos from this meeting.
Anyone else before we sign off? There's thank yous coming. Appreciate your time, Stephanie, and willingness to help us get some clarification where we need it. And as I mentioned, I think a little blurb for the monthly vegetable and berry grower news for folks that may not be here or watch the webinar later to know that July 1, things have changed with these materials.
Excellent.
Well, great. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you at next season's webinars.
Yep.
if not
Have a good
before.
season, everybody.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.